Mass protests continued across the United States for the 8th consecutive night over the killing of an unarmed black man named George Flyod at the hands of a white police officer in Minneapolis. Let's get you the recent updates from what's happening on ground in the United States. For more than 40 cities now, curfews have been imposed, including New York and Washington, D.C. But even with curfew hours looming, protesters refused to budge from the streets. And the protests, which took a violent turn in the last few days, were largely peaceful, even with the National Guard's presence in most states. Governors are now pushing back against the use of police force. In Minneapolis, where it all began, thousands of demonstrators gathered in front of the Minnesota state capitol, and protesters continue to demand that all officers involved in Floyd's death be charged. Currently, only one officer is charged with third-degree murder, and that is Derek Chauvin, and he was the one who was found kneeling on George Floyd's neck until he died of strangulation.
Wait, I want to get this after. Hold on, look at me first.
In Houston, the family of George Floyd joined the protesters in a rally, and more than 60,000 demonstrators were seen marching down the streets of the city where George Floyd grew up.
They anticipated the number. I told them.
In the capital, Washington, D.C., demonstrators were back on the streets, violating the curfew to continue protesting.
Our streets! Our streets! Our streets! Our streets! Our streets!
And after yesterday's violent clashes, a black chain link fence had to be put up overnight to block access to the White House. But protesters remained undeterred, with their hands clasped behind them. Many of them were seen lying on a road close to the White House, calling for justice.
Don't shoot! Don't shoot! Don't shoot!
In Los Angeles, demonstrators filled the streets in the Hollywood area, with the police and National Guard troops on the scene. The California National Guard has now deployed 2,430 members to assist the law enforcement statewide.
Defund the police! Defund the police! Defund the police!
Protesters were seen struck by tear gas as demonstrations in the city of Seattle turned violent. The video on your screens shows plumes of smoke rising around protesters. The residents of New York City staged a peaceful protest outside Mayor Bill de Blasio's residence an hour before the city enforced curfew. For the first time since the Second World War, New York prolonged its first curfew for the full week. Nurses and healthcare workers in New York also took the knee to honor protesters who marched by. Police brutality is what protesters are condemning in the various protests across the United States. While some protests themselves have seen excessive use of force by the police officers, many of them have come ahead in support of the demonstrators. In fact, in Denver, the police chief, Paul Payson, linked arms with the protesters, marching with them through the city.